folks. Welcome back to another compilation of strange wilderness stories sent to me by our listeners. And I've got another volume of disappearances that I'll be uploading soon, but in the meantime, here's a few more downright strange experiences I thought I'd share with you. So here you go. Hello, Rusty. I've been listening to your stories for quite a while now, and I've heard a lot of strange ones, but nothing quite like the one that I had. I feel as though my own experience is unique enough to share with you and the listeners, and I haven't heard anything else quite like it. Recently, I was visiting Yellowstone with my roommate Zane. We were just wrapping up a short but somewhat difficult hike on Uncle Tom's Trail, and probably only had about 10 minutes left before we reached the trailhead. The section of trail we were on opened up to a large grassy field surrounded by thick brush and vegetation. Well, when we entered that clearing, there was a medium-sized white-tailed deer just standing in the middle of it, completely fixated on something off to the side of it. It stood there, as still as a statue, completely unfazed by our presence. And believe me, we made a lot of noise plowing through there. Still, Zane and I waited to see what it would do. But after watching this deer further, we began to assume that someone may have put a prop there as a prank or something. I shouted out and stomped my boots to get a reaction from it. But it didn't move. As we slowly and cautiously approached the deer, we could see that it was real, all right. We saw the rise and fall of her chest, so she was breathing, and we can see the beady black eyes and the reflection that it contained. We assumed the poor thing was having some kind of medical issue or something. That was until a loud pop emerged from the nearby woods, and the deer began to shriek. Not knowing what to do, we just stood there waiting to see what would happen. The deer broke into a whimper, and her loud cries filled the valley. Stunned, we both jolted around the deer and ran toward the trailhead. But as we did so, the deer made an awful sound, which was immediately cut short, like I didn't even have a chance to finish her cry. Then it went quiet. We were gone after that. Both Zane and I are curious and wanted to ask, has anyone else out there experienced this? Personally, it reminded me of a prey who had been caught by its predator and held into place, awaiting its imminent demise, kind of like a bug caught in a spider web. I could tell the deer wanted to break free and run away, but it was as though something wouldn't let it. Thanks for sharing my strange story. My name is Javier, and just last summer, I was hiking Saguaro National Park inside Pima County, Arizona. My solo hike took me through the Signal Hill Trail and out to the petroglyphs of the ancient Hohokam people, a sight well worth checking out if you're looking for some stunning historical visuals. It was around 2 p.m. when I arrived to the site and stopped to appreciate the views. Around that time, a small group of tourists were making their way back, and not long after that, I had the whole place to myself. I remember specifically lowering my green backpack on the ground next to me and fishing out my Nikon camera to take some video of the surrounding terrain. A rocky and golden oasis dotted with cacti and uniquely shaped boulders. Amongst them were the artistic animal petroglyphs put there by the ancient folks who once habited the region thousands of years ago. After a moment, I felt the need to quench my thirst, as I sweat up a storm during the hike out there. But when I went to reach for my pack where my water was, the damn thing was gone, and I mean nowhere in sight. It took me a moment to digest the fact that my 40-pound survival pack had simply vanished into nothingness. It was like the thing grew legs and wandered off. So there I was, standing in the middle of the desert like an idiot, with no water and a camera in my hand. I scoured the landscape, thinking perhaps an animal had dragged it away, even though I knew the chances of that were as slim as a stick figure. About 15 minutes went by, and I continued to look. The heat was bearing down now, causing my lips to blister and my throat to swell. And for the first time ever, I realized just how dire the situation had gotten. It had been way too long since I drank any water, and nearly just as long since the last tourists left the site. I knew I had to get out of there as my life depended on it. I gave up the search for my backpack and returned to the very trail that had taken me out there. I was looking at another 2 hours to get back to the trailhead. I only had one option if I wanted to survive this ordeal, and that was to run and try to catch up with the other hikers who left a while back. But this would prove to be a monumental effort for someone on the verge of dehydration. My only chance of survival was catching up to those hikers, and back down that trail I went, as fast as my aching legs could take me, hoping that the group had stopped to rest along the way. But as I continued to hurry back, I heard what sounded like shouting off in the distance behind me. The closer I listened, the more they sounded like questions being asked in a completely different language. Now, I have traveled to many different countries and can speak several languages myself, but this was not like any language I'd ever heard before. And it was getting closer. The vocal range was impressive and frankly quite shocking. It became pluralistic in nature and appeared to be coming from a few different directions. I was tempted to stop and see who or what was behind those voices, but honestly, I thought they were a product of my dehydration, as they sounded completely unnatural to me. At that point, I felt myself slowly going insane and losing touch with reality, and I lost track of time. But in a stroke of luck, I spotted the colorful clothing of the tour group right ahead of me, about a mile away or so. I was finally catching up to them, and it took everything I had to try to get them to stop and notice my cries for help. It's amazing how muted one's voice can get when you're dehydrated. My shouting came out in dry squeaks, but it was my whistling that eventually got their attention. When they saw my condition, they gathered around me and offered what water they could supply. I remember how grateful I was to be alive after that. We made it back in one piece, and I was lucky enough to walk away with only a sunburn and a high fever. But to this day, I am completely at a loss for how my pack vanished so quickly and what those strange voices were. My solo backpacking days are over, and now I only use the buddy system while venturing outdoors. I do wonder if I'm alone in my experience. Thank you for sharing my story. I'm not quite sure how to begin, so I'll just dive right into it. This sort of ties in with another one of your stories about the couple's dog who mysteriously vanished out of their parked car inside Grand Canyon National Park. But in my case, a dog didn't go missing, but instead appeared out of nowhere in my back seat. So let me explain what happened. I had just returned from my car after a grueling 7-mile hike to the bottom of the South Rim and back. I remember unlocking my door to my Kia Soul and sat down in the driver's seat to rest up a bit. With the car door still open, I took a long gulp from my water bottle when something, out of nowhere, violently knocked it out of my hand and onto my lap, splashing water all over myself. A large black dog had just jumped out from behind the seat and over me and escaped out the door. From there I watched it dart off into the horizon before disappearing behind some shrubbery. I got out of the car, soaking wet, and took a long, confused look around me before searching the rest of the car. I examined my windows and my doors. Both driver and passenger side windows were still cracked open a couple inches. Otherwise, everything was shut and locked. So how in the hell did this dog get in there? To this day, I still don't know what to make of it, and I sure hope that dog found its owner. Several years ago, I spent the night clinging to the top of a red cedar deep in the heart of the Washington wilderness, but not by choice. If you've ever tried to climb such a tree, it's not the most comfortable tree in the world to climb through, nor is it the easiest. But the alternative would have been much worse. I was about halfway through a 3-day backpacking trip through the Mount Baker Wilderness area when I found myself completely trapped and cut off by, well, a pack of red foxes. Before you laugh, let me explain the details of this frightening encounter. I was minding my own business, just hiking up the trail when I noticed a couple red foxes darting back and forth on the trail ahead of me. I figured they were feeding on something and had gotten spooked when they saw me. Well, I just kept trekking on and assumed they'd retreat into the surrounding woodline. But they didn't, even when I drew close. In fact, the 2 foxes were joined by several others. 3 more emerged from the woods and joined the first 2. That's about the time I stopped and observed this peculiar gathering. And then I saw even more emerge from the woods, and I began to lose count after the 9th or 10th one. I began to get this sickening feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. The now large group of foxes were all staring at me, and that's when I lowered my backpack slowly and pulled out my sidearm, ready for an attack. Up until this point, I hadn't heard of anyone being attacked by red foxes in the area, but I wasn't about to let my guard down either. Before I made the decision to fire off a few warning shots, the foxes began making these ear-piercing screeches and were nodding their heads as they did so. I had a slight notion to turn and look behind me. I was shocked to see another large group of foxes had formed and were working their way toward me. The second group had managed to gain more ground than the first, while sneaking up on my 6. I was now surrounded by several dozen hungry red foxes, all about the size of a large house cat, and I only had a dozen rounds in my pistol. I fired off my first warning shot, and this seemed to help as they withdrew and scattered a bit, but then returned a short time later and now there were even more than before. I couldn't believe it. This time, I shot at the ground in front and back of me. Again, they retreated slightly and then proceeded toward me once again. They sure as hell weren't giving up. In fact, they seemed more determined now to get to me than ever. I was a bit petrified at that point, and then I realized I was in imminent danger of being overtaken by him, and I couldn't imagine a worse fate than being eaten alive by a pack of wild animals in the middle of nowhere and far away from help. I only had a few rounds left in my gun, and there was no way I'd be able to outrun them. The only option I could think of was jumping into a nearby tree and getting off the ground. And so I did. About that time, both groups of foxes broke into a dead sprint and advanced toward me. By the time I reached the base of the cedar, they were just seconds from reaching me. I plowed my way up into that tree, enduring cuts and bruises as I did so, while picking off insects I had collected on the way up. I was probably around 20 to 30 feet up before peering down to look at the group gathering at the base now. They were all hooting and hollering, hunger pains in their cries, and I can feel the shivers running down my spine. I was forced to sit in that tree as the sun dropped below the horizon, and as the darkness moved in, I could no longer see the animals, but I could still hear them everywhere, screaming and crying in frustration. I could also hear them picking away at my backpack, which I had abandoned on the trail. There were so many now, and I kept my gun trained on the ground, prepared to drop whatever foxes might be climbing up the tree. But lucky for me, they didn't. They just kept circling the tree like sharks for hours on end, until first light came. By this point, my whole body was aching, and I was exhausted beyond words. The army of foxes had retreated back into the wilderness, and I waited a while before even attempting to descend and salvage whatever backpacking supplies I could find. My pack was useless now, and most of it was either chewed up or gone, including most of the supplies. I was, however, able to salvage my canteen and a few other rations that I had stored in a hard container. I used whatever energy I had left and got the hell out of there, watching my back the entire way back to the trailhead. My experience gave me a much-needed wake-up call about the dangers of hiking by one's lonesome. I don't recommend it, but if you do, be sure to carry enough ammo to fend off an army of red foxes. In the summer of 2016, I was with a group of friends traveling from Nevada to Idaho for a little sightseeing adventure and to visit an old friend I haven't seen in years. There were 4 of us in the car, and I was seated in the rear driver's side, just leaning back and staring off into the window at the beautiful wilderness while listening to my headphones. We were all pretty quiet, just doing our own thing, when I spotted something peculiar off in the distance. At this point, I believe we were driving somewhere in between Estes Park and Twin Sisters, which is completely surrounded by the Roosevelt Wilderness. The road we were on opened up into a vast prairie-like valley, and behind it were the iconic rocky stacks which climbed high to the crystal-clear blue sky. Here's what we saw. About 100 yards away or so, I saw a beautiful woman, dressed like a pioneer, walking almost parallel to us. Because the grass was so tall, We could only see about half of her, the top half. She had a white, turn-of-the-century blouse and long dark hair that covered her porcelain white face. She didn't seem to pay any attention to us as we drove by her, but everyone in the car took notice of this interesting sight until we disappeared around a bend on the road. We all agreed it was kind of strange and decided to turn the car around to see if she needed any assistance, given how odd it was to see a beautiful woman in the middle of nowhere, randomly walking in the hot wilderness. There were no other cars on that stretch of road either, which only added to the strangeness, and there was no sign of civilization for miles and miles. But when we returned to that spot seconds later, the woman was gone, nowhere to be seen. We pulled off to the side of the road, got out, and began shouting to the woman. But we were only met with the sound of insects buzzing in the hot summer sun. We never did see her again after that, and honestly, I don't see how a woman dressed in white could just simply vanish in plain sight, and in such a short amount of time. Was she perhaps a ghost from the pioneer days? We can't help but wonder. Thank you for sharing my story. And there you have it. I think we can all learn a little something about these experiences and how they might pertain to us during our outdoor adventures. Be safe out there and stay tuned for new material coming soon.